Shabbat Shalom. If you have hired somebody to do a job, paint a house, fix your toilet, and they're not doing a good job, what do? Get someone else, right? Get someone else. So does that explain then the oddity of our Haftarah? Because our Haftarah is weird. Hopefully you were following along and not just taking a nap while I was chanting. I was certainly trying to keep it lively. And you recognize that something very, very unusual happens in the middle of the Haftarah. King Saul loses his job. King Saul loses his job. How does a king lose his job? I mean, he's king. And in the inimitable phrasing of Mel Brooks, it's good to be king. Who gets to tell the king that he's fired? I mean, this is something that, as a general principle, most of the Western world was not comfortable with until the French Revolution began lopping off heads. And even they started slowly and were not ready to take that dramatic step. But here, because he messed up a few times, it wasn't just one instant, but this was definitely the most egregious of errors, here, the prophet Samuel comes up and says, you're fired. You no longer get to be king. And Saul seems to accept this. It's not only with Saul that we see this power of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. We see too with David, when he has blundered with Bathsheba, that when he is reprimanded, he accepts the reprimand and says, yes, you're right, I have transgressed here. His son Solomon as well will mess up so badly that he will lose more than 2/3 of the kingdom, by population at least, with the top 10 tribes being pulled away from the kingdom of Judah, which will remain as a sort of rump state in the south. The prophets time and time again will stride into the courts of the mighty throughout our history and blast them for failing to behave according to the laws that God has laid down. This notion that we essentially have a constitutional monarchy, that is to say, a monarch's reign is contingent upon their continued observance of the laws of Torah as explained through the Nevi'im, is remarkably modern and unfortunately generally ignored. That is to say, after David, and even to some extent through the tenure of Solomon, kings get worse and worse at actually listening to the prophets. And we begin to see the prophets don't have an army. The prophets don't have any force with which to implement their teachings. And of course, we begin the downward spiral of the both northern and southern kingdoms into their eventual destruction. More on that later. Now, why am I drawing your attention to this so sharply? Well, because we can see within classical Jewish understanding, both within the Torah, the Tanakh, as well as within rabbinic interpretation of this, that Judaism has always understood that there need to be certain checks to power. There need to be certain balances to power. The Torah goes on later in Deuteronomy to describe the limits to the power of a king in general. And like I said, the prophets put that into practice, continually rebuking the kings, sometime getting their way, but always making sure that a king remembers that they are beneath Adonai, and their actions matter, and their actions must map to the Torah's instructions. Which is why I have to bring you up to date with current events in Medinat Yisrael, as opposed to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the land that's been there for thousands and thousands of years, Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, which has been there for 75 wonderful, glorious years through thick and thin. But she is undergoing a crisis now. I've mentioned this a few times. Hopefully you've looked in a little bit over the last couple of weeks to what the current controversy is. Hundreds of thousands of Israeli cities pouring out into the streets of Tel Aviv to protest should be telling you that there is something amiss, something that is controversial. And it's not a controversial peace plan. It is not a controversial treatment of terrorists. It's not a controversial policy towards Iran. All of those things we can talk about, and we do, but that is not what's bringing hundreds of thousands of Israeli cities out into the streets. They're coming out into the streets for the Supreme Court. I know, sounds a little weird. Why would hundreds of thousands of people think that they have nothing better to do Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, than to hang out in the streets of Tel Aviv saying that they like the Supreme Court the way it is? It's not quite something that we as Americans maybe can fathom. Well, first we have to back up, because I'm looking around the room and I don't see anybody here that I think has ever told me that they are a deep, deep student of the Israeli political system. So I have to first warn you, it's not identical to America's. Right? I know many of us are very used to the American system, and we tend to think that that is copied all around the world. It's not. In fact, most countries do not have anything like our system, and Israel is very unlike. So Israel is unicameral. Going back to your civics class, that means it has only one house of its legislature, known as the Knesset, and that Knesset will then choose a prime minister. Usually that is done through coalition wrangling, trying to get multiple parties to agree on who will be the prime minister until they disagree and a new election is called. At this time, we have a coalition with Benjamin Netanyahu at the head, who is the prime minister. So you can see already the legislative branch and the executive branch are married together. The chief executive, the prime minister, is a representative of the legislature and chosen by the legislature, which means you do not have a veto process. If the legislature, if the Knesset decided to vote for something, it is inconceivable that the prime minister would not be in agreement with it, and thus the prime minister's bills will come to pass. That's what it means to have a majority, unlike in the American political system where you have to fight through the House, where even your own party may vote against you, and then you have to vote through the Senate, where somebody may vote against you, or filibuster, and who knows what, which slows down legislature, as I think we're all fairly well aware of in the American system. In Israel, if they decide to do something, once it comes out of the committee and has had the pro forma debate upon the floor of the Knesset, it is done, because the executive and the legislature are in agreement. Well, what about the courts? Well, the courts occupy a very ambiguous spot in Israeli political culture, because Israel, to also make it different from the United States, does not have a fixed formal constitution. Way back in 1948, there was a committee convened to create a constitution. They looked around the room and they said, well, why don't we just hang around as the parliament and we'll get to doing a constitution later? Because after all, we're in the middle of a war. Since the moment Israel declared independence, she was attacked. That was certainly understandable at the time, but long-term now, 75 years, there have been years of peace aplenty that could have been used to craft a constitution, but Israel has never gotten around to doing so. As such, their Supreme Court will adjudicate on the validity of the laws, of whether they pass muster as being valid to even be laws, based upon the Declaration of Independence that Israel ushered in her existence with, as well as certain other so-called basic laws, basic principles that seem to have been reinforced and ratified in the ideals of what Israel aspires to throughout her existence. Well, there are people in the current coalition, that is to say the actual politicians, not the members of their parties, that does not like that system. Because what happens with a system like that? Well, the legislature thinks that there should be a new law. For example, maybe there should be a new law that says it's okay for there to be discrimination against conservative Jews when making aliyah. That you are not Orthodox, therefore when you come to make aliyah, we can deny you citizenship, we can deny you entry, we can run you through the runaround of bureaucratic red tape until you finally give up and don't bother anymore. And the Supreme Court can say, no. We hold that Israel is a country for all Jews. You don't get to pass that legislation. And the Knesset says, yeah, but we have a majority. And the Supreme Court says, tough. Well, the Knesset coalition is tired of being told, tough. They are tired of being told that their laws, which in our own personal interest, often will discriminate against conservative Jews and other non-Orthodox Jews. And I should also point out, for the sake of those that might be feeling a bit more secular, although not too many secular people come to shul on Saturday morning, it will also discriminate against secular Jews, reinforcing the restrictions and requirements that they must abide by rabbinic edicts of an ever more stringent orthodoxy, as well as providing for an unequal quality of service. That is to say, there will be an unfairness. New districts will be built in order to house people with cheaper housing if they are coalition partners, as opposed to non-coalition partners. And of course, most galling of all, this will undo the hard-fought slog, which has still not been completely implemented, to actually ensure a full representation in the military, that all must serve equally in order for Israel to survive. And that has been a bone of contention within the coalition for many, many years. And the Supreme Court has said many, many times over many, many years, you're not allowed to allow part of our population not to serve just because that's the price of their participation in politics. If they are going to be citizens of the country, they are going to be in the IDF. And that continues to be stymied. And honestly, the Knesset coalition currently in power would very much like to stop hearing from the Supreme Court. So what is the proposition? Well, it's simple. The Knesset is advancing legislation that will allow the Knesset to overturn a Supreme Court decision. Well, first, they are raising the bar that if the Supreme Court makes a decision, it needs to be, that overturns a law as being invalid, it needs to be made by at least 80% of the 15-person Supreme Court. And if that 80% threshold is not met, then the law will stand. If that 80% threshold is met, then it goes back to the Knesset, who can then, under the new legislation, override that judicial veto by a simple majority. Let me just make sure you understand the implications of that. It means that the Knesset, which passed the legislation by simple majority, can override a supermajority of the Supreme Court by a simple majority, which is what was needed to pass the legislation in the first place. Which means the Supreme Court will have no power. In order to make sure this point is really driven home, they are also changing the way that Supreme Court justices will be appointed. Unlike our own beautifully elegant system of Supreme Court nomination and appointment, the current Israeli system involves a 9-person panel, 4 of which are appointed by the Knesset, by the coalition, 2 of which are appointed by the Bar Association, and 3 of which are appointed by the court themselves. That is to say, the judges help choose who the new judges will be. And we can argue about the balance there, but it is important to understand that it needs a 7 out of 9-person vote to appoint anyone to the court, which means no one group within that committee has a majority to push that through, and it means that pretty much all of the court appointees have to be approved by a very wide range of interests and values. The new proposed change to the appointment will be to create a 11-person committee, 7 of which will be appointed by the Knesset, meaning that the Knesset will be able to appoint whomever they wish with no checks or balances coming from any of the traditional sources that Israel has relied upon for her courts for years. So, if the legislation goes through, the Knesset will be able to stack the court with whomever they wish. The current coalition will have carte blanche to appoint whomever they like. And even if that court that they appointed decides that what they have done is somehow antithetical to all that Israel stands for, now the Knesset can say, tough, we're doing it anyway. Because if we had the votes to pass it in the first place, we have the votes to override your 80% of the court veto. You're beginning to get an understanding why 200,000 people are coming out to protest this in the state of Israel. This is an alarming situation. And I wanted to make sure you understood this because you are going to hear, if you have not already, attacks and criticisms from around our country and around the world about this being undemocratic, about this being a move towards despotism that mirrors the behavior of Hungary, of Poland, and of Turkey. And you should understand that those criticisms are not anti-Semitic. Yes, we can debate about the merits of how the current arrangement of power is distributed within Israel, and Israel herself has had different experiments with how she has run her courts, of how she has had a prime minister that was elected independently than the Knesset, and all sorts of other issues. And that's fine to have those debates and discussions. But if this legislation goes through, there will no longer be any check on any policy that any Knesset chooses to implement for Israel. They will simply be able to do whatever they wish to do. Yes, eventually they may need to stand for re-election, but who will tell them that they need to stand for re-election? If legislation is passed extending the term of a Knesset to 10 years, to 15 years, to 20 years, if legislation is passed saying that those who were currently elected can choose their successors rather than going back to the poll, well, the Supreme Court will no longer be able to tell them that that is unconstitutional, that that is against the principles of Israel. There will be no check other than the goodwill of those currently in power. This is dangerous. This is problematic. There are many different reasons of why it's being done, and we can talk about those in more detail. But I want you to understand that not only will this affect conservative Jews in Israel, that this will affect all the Jews in Israel. And we have learned through our own history that having a check upon a king, having a check upon rabbis, having a check upon the Reish Galuta, the head of the diaspora communities at different times in different places, is essential for ensuring that there is a barrier against corruption and abuse of power. And Israel is currently considering legislation that will undo the last check against potential abuses of power. And you're going to hear many people say that in the news and commentaries online. By all means, if they say typical Jew, then yes, they are anti-Semitic, and you can call them out for that. But if they say this smacks of something that is undemocratic, they've got a point. And that's something to consider, as indeed hundreds of thousands of Israelis are considering. And we would not call them anti-Semitic when they pour into the streets of Tel Aviv to make their voice heard. We need to recognize that there is always room for debate and discussion, and there is room for protest. And we may not be voting in the elections of Israel, but we should still care with all of our heart about her safety in all of the ways, not only from external foes and attackers who continue to besiege her, but also from those problems that may be eroding the strength of her nation from within. Shabbat Shalom.